our meeting. Thank you for joining the Colorado Stream Management Plan peer call on federal funding for implementation. My name is Chelsea Silva, and I'm with River Network. I mentioned this before, but if you'd like to share your organization, the native lands from which you're joining, and your preferred pronouns in the chat, feel free to do so. And for today's call, we will be using the chat to ask questions. This just makes it a little easier. It avoids having to mute and unmute. If you do need to mute and unmute to ask your question, that's fine. But if you can throw it in the chat, that will work best. Also, just so you know, we will have Q&A after each presentation. So you'll have space to ask people right away about the content they provide. And maybe we'll have a little time at the end as well. We've also, the presenters for today have offered to answer any questions that don't get answered during our call in a follow-up. So I'll be sending out any questions, any responses to questions after the event if we end up having any. My last note before I jump into a little bit about our organization is that at the end of this event, if you have time, it's only 2 minutes, we would love for you to provide feedback through our post-event survey. I'll share that link at the end, but it helps us a lot as we're planning these events, and it helps us to make adjustments and make them fit your needs, which is the purpose of these events. They're for you. So please keep that in mind. So for those who aren't familiar with River Network, River Network's mission is to grow and strengthen a transformational national network of water, justice, and river advocates. We envision a powerful and inclusive movement that ensures abundant, clean water for all people and nature to thrive. You can learn more about our organization at rivernetwork.org. As an organization, we actually focus on 3 areas: healthy, resilient rivers, safe, affordable drinking water, and climate resilient communities. River Network as an organization hosts a nationwide network. I'm going to be talking about the peer learning network for stream management plans in a minute, but this national network has free and premium memberships. With a free membership, it's easy. You can just sign up using this link here, which I'll throw in the chat later. But you can access learning sessions, trainings, peer calls. You get access to an online community, members throughout the nation who are working on watershed issues. So check that out. There are people doing awesome work all over the nation. As I mentioned, this call is actually part of our Colorado Stream Management Plan peer learning network, which is aimed at providing leaders and coalitions who are working on stream management plans in Colorado a space for sharing information, solving problems, and learning from each other. We also host workshops, field trips, and peer calls like this one, and we have an online community as well. And so if you're interested and you're working on a stream management plan or an integrated watershed management plan in Colorado, check out more information on our website, coloradosmp.org. We have a contact form. If you're not already linked in with us, please be sure to do so. So with that, our agenda for today. First, we have a couple of announcements. I'll provide 2, and then I'll pass it over to my colleague, Nicole Seltzer. Next, we're going to hear from Elle Benson with Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership on an overview of federal funding, and Elle is also going to talk about water smart programs. Then we'll hear from Jesse Kruthaupt and Kyle Balint. Sorry if I mispronounced your names. I meant to ask you ahead of time and I didn't. With Trout Unlimited on summiting the funding mountain peaks and valleys using NRCS grants to achieve healthy rivers. Next, we'll hear from Blongshia B. Cha with the U.S. Natural Resources Conservation Service and Scott Griebling with St. Vrain and Left Hand Water Conservancy District on PL 566 funding and a sponsor experience. Our last presentation is from the wonderful Anna Mauss with the Colorado Water Conservation Board. She will be sharing information about the federal technical assistance grants, which I've lumped as capacity building grants, and the team that they've brought on to help manage these grants and also provide technical support. And we'll close it out with that evaluation that I asked you all to do. So jumping into announcements, this peer call today is our first event of the year for the Colorado Stream Management Plan Peer Learning Network. We have another call coming up on April 5th at 10 a.m. We are still working on the details of what the topic will be, but be sure to put that on your calendar. We're also excited to share that this year we'll be hosting 2 field trips through this network, one in mid-May and one in mid to late July. Again, those topics and dates are still in the works, but the hope is that the mid-May event will be hosted on the Front Range, and then the mid to late July event will be on the West Slope in Colorado. We post all that information on the coloradosmp.org page, and if you're part of our online network already, that information will go to your inbox. My second update is that we are hosting we're doing an evaluation of our Colorado Stream Management Plan Peer Learning Network with support from Point B Strategies, a Colorado-based firm. We've been hosting this peer learning network for about 6 or 7 years now, and we thought it was a good time for us to take a step back and think through what's worked well, what we could maybe improve, and what can kind of help us move forward with the peer learning network into the future. Of course, we're going to look to you to learn about what has worked well and what you think could be improved. So there will be multiple opportunities for you to be involved as Stream Management Plan Peer Learning Network members. That will look like a member survey. We're going to host a few focus groups, and we'll have key informant interviews as well. So be on the lookout, because I would love to hear from you so that we can do a thorough evaluation of this network and make it improve in the future. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Nicole for her announcement on Environmental Flow's Peer Learning Network cohort. So I'll stop sharing and give it over to you, Nicole.
Thank you, Chelsea. Good morning, everybody from snowy Steamboat Springs. Nice to see everybody. I just have a super quick update and kind of we're going to do an assessment of interest on an idea. So you will see more about this, and there will be a way for you to share your interest with me kind of going forward. I didn't quite get it done this morning. Thought I could. But essentially, a little bit of background. In 2022, CWCB and River Network hosted some workshops with NGOs and state agency staff around barriers and opportunities for environmental flows in the stream management planning process. We were seeing that, one of the original purposes of the stream management plan program when it came out of the 2015 water plan was to set environmental flow recommendations in rivers. And through an analysis of the outcomes of stream management plans through 2022, we found that that is not happening necessarily at a rate that we would have anticipated or hoped early on. And so we spent several months in workshops with some people trying to dig into that and ask why. And so we developed a memo and a white paper to Chris Sturm's team at CWCB to dig into that. And there's a series of recommendations on how we can try to help local coalitions come out the other end of a stream management planning process with some flow recommendations for sections of river. And one of the ideas is the development of a cohort of coalitions across the state that are working on assessment of flows in their rivers with an eye toward either developing new environmental flow recommendations, and that could be something formal like an in-stream flow, or informal, just like we would like to see this CFS in this section during this time of year, but it's not an in-stream flow water right. And also some support to identify strategies to meet existing environmental flow recommendations on your river. If you have an in-stream flow that's not being met, or you have existing flow targets and you aren't quite sure how to meet them, the cohort would kind of bring people together to help problem solve through that. So this is a joint effort through the Colorado Water Trust, River Network, and Western Resource Advocates. The three organizations come at this from different ways, and we have different skill sets within our organizations, and we have different funding sources to support different aspects of environmental flow target setting. And so we are basically at the point where we think this is a good idea, and we need to know if other people think this is a good idea. So this is a document that we're going to put on coloradosmp.org, hopefully by the end of the day today. And Chelsea will send out a link to everybody so you can look at it. But essentially, it gives a little bit of background and describes kind of the opportunity that we are thinking about providing. And then it gives you a way to tell us whether this is something that you would be interested in for your coalition on your river. So we need to see if there's, I'm thinking somewhere between 4 and 6 coalitions in the state. We need to decide if this is worth time for us to pull this together. And if so, exactly what it would look like to support coalitions who are interested in some technical assistance, education, and training on environmental flow development. So keep your eyes peeled for a little bit more information. We would start this up sometime probably early summer, maybe like late May or so, and it would last for probably about 12 to 18 months. And so you would basically, it would be kind of structured like this peer learning network, but there would also be a technical assistance and training component to it as well. So that is all I have, Chelsea. Thank you for the time. And yeah, be on the lookout.
Thanks so much, Nicole. And if folks have questions, we can certainly be in touch on email, or as Nicole said, we'll send out more information. With that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Elle, and Elle's going to share her screen and give us a federal funding overview and WaterSmart intro.
Great, and let me see if I can find the screen. I just had it, so I know it's going to work. I just need to find it. Let's see. Can you guys see this? Okay. And in slideshow mode, let's see. Great. Okay. Thank you so much. Yes. I'm Elle Benson, the Southwestern Water Program Coordinator here at Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, TRCP. So we're a partnership-based organization, as you could have guessed, meaning that we do mainly policy work, and we don't do any on-the-ground projects, but we are really focused in Western states, specifically Colorado with my colleague Alex, and then New Mexico with myself, on getting federal funds to the ground for watershed work. So I'm here today to do an overview of federal funding. There's a lot available right now through these two bills, the IIJA and the IRA, which I will go over briefly. And then I'll do a deep dive into WaterSmart, a few of the programs that I thought would be most relevant, and then offer some resources to navigating some of these funds. So to start us off, I'll give an overview here of federal funding, starting with IIJA, which is also called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or bill, but I'll call it IIJA throughout here. So this was the biggest federal investment in water infrastructure and climate resilience ever. It goes through about 400 federal programs, both new and existing, and a lot of that is through competitive grant programs. It really focuses on more shovel-ready projects, and there isn't a ton of opportunity. There are some exceptions here, but generally there's not a ton of opportunity for pre-project development or technical assistance, at least compared to the Inflation Reduction Act, which I'll talk about next. And the general rule of thumb is that funding is available through fiscal year 2026. This bill was passed in November of 2021. So we are a little bit into this implementation timeline. I'm not going to go over all the things that are in there because there's a ton, but just to call out a few, there's 400 million Reclamation's Water Smart programs, including 100 million for new multi-benefit water projects program, which is, like I said, new, and then another new program that's, I believe, 250 million for aquatic ecosystem restoration and protection projects. And I've heard that there'll be more information available about that early this year, may already be posted. And then $100 million in the Cooperative Watershed Management Program, which I'll talk about later in these slides. So there's a ton of money, basically, through that act. And then late last year, following up on that, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. And it's a little bit different from the bipartisan infrastructure law in that it has a lot of opportunity for new programs as well as pre-existing ones. And there's a lot of opportunity to cover kind of that full project pipeline development, pre-project planning, unlike IIJA. And another thing that makes it really cool is that there's a lot of opportunity for those federal cost share and matching requirements to be waived. So a lot of these funds are allocated specifically without those requirements, or there's an opportunity for them to be waived at the discretion of the secretary for the agency that is implementing those dollars. There's also investment in kind of streamlining processes. So there's money for NEPA review and things like that, as well as staffing for agencies. I believe NRCS got $1 billion to support staffing. And again, I won't go over all the things that are in here, but there's a big chunk, $4 billion for drought mitigation in Western states that goes to Bureau of Reclamation for public entities, tribes, and pueblos. And priority was given to the Colorado River Basin, as well as states or areas that are experiencing similar drought. So for those of you that work, on the Rio Grande or in the San Luis Valley, TRCP is really interested in making sure that similarly affected, drought-affected regions get a chunk of that money as well. So now for the second part here, going into Water Smart, just as a general overview, it's typical that they have Water Smart grants have a 50% cost share or matching requirement. There is some variation, which I'll talk about, but that's kind of the rule of thumb. And then it's available to, or these grants are available to states, tribes, irrigation and water districts, organizations with water power delivery authority, and nonprofits that are partnered with any of these. So I'm going to talk about a few different programs within Water Smart. There's a ton of Bureau of Reclamation grant programs, so I won't do a deep dive into all of them, but I did pull out a few that I thought would be most relevant here. So when first created, Water Smart grants were really focused on these water and efficiency grants. So those are things like water savings projects, so things like canal lining, which is what I tried to visualize here on the bottom, and metering. And then projects within this are prioritized for funding if they have kind of multiple benefits. So, in addition to water savings, if they also have a climate change or drought mitigation component. Small scale water efficiency projects are somewhat similar, but they're much smaller, and they have a streamlined application process because they're smaller and the funding amount can't exceed $250,000. So again, that's things like these smaller lining and piping projects or measuring projects. And then if you have an existing like water management or conservation plan in place, then the project will likely be prioritized for funding. So this one's cool and it's newer, the Environmental Water Resources Projects Program, which is a watershed restoration conservation bucket. So it again includes, quantifiable reductions in water use or consumptive water use, as well as projects that have kind of watershed or ecosystem benefits. So things like watershed restoration, addressing water quality or quantity, addressing temperature concerns, protecting plant and animal species, and then projects that restore natural systems are also included in here. So it's a pretty big bucket. And then if it has, multiple benefits for multiple groups or stakeholders or sectors, then it will likely be prioritized. And then the last the last one that I'll go into is the Cooperative Watershed Management Program. So that's important for watershed groups. It offers opportunity to develop these groups and planning. And that phase 1 is up to $100,000 annually for 2 years, and it doesn't have a cost share requirement. So it's a really important piece of that pre-project development planning through this program. And then I hyperlinked a bunch of other BOR programs. I didn't think anyone here was gonna, have a big desalination project or anything like that, but just wanted to link those here too, and these slides will go out, so more than welcome to poke around in any of those. So if you are applying for one of these grants, what we've heard is that this is the general timeline that you can expect. So NOFOs are typically open about 2 months, 60 days, followed by a 12 to 16 week review process, a 6 to 8 week selection process, and then a 3 to 6 month award phase, and then the actual, project, which can be, I believe, up to 3 years, but it could be 2. So it's a several year projects. So other things that I've heard will be helpful, and again, we're a policy-based organization, so we don't do any on-the-ground projects, and we don't do any of the grant writing, but just attending, BOR meetings and things that they've offered that have been really helpful. I've heard that things that are helpful if you're applying are like keeping in mind inflation when you're preparing your budget, especially now. And then NOFOs include these application checklists. And so having your submission sort of in that format, I've heard has been helpful. And then here are 2 additional resources if you're interested in applying: the calendar where you can find what's coming out or what stage different things are in. And then grants or funding opportunities are available here at grants.gov. So I just wanted to provide those. So WaterSmart is a really wonderful program. It has a ton of cash, but there are some real drawbacks that I think are worth mentioning. TRCP has been working on a report that was finished up in July of this year on universal barriers, is what we're calling them. So issues and barriers and bottlenecks basically to accessing federal funding, including things like WaterSmart. And where TRCP as an organization is interested in trying to be able to some of those barriers and bottlenecks, both at the state and federal level for policy work. But I'm just going to touch on a few of the things that we've heard have been challenges for this particular pot of funding. So one, most of the funds are really for the shovel-ready projects, with the exception, I'd say, of that Cooperative Watershed Management Program that I talked about earlier, which does have some funding at no cost share requirement for some pre-project work. But yeah, a lot of the funding through WaterSmart and, through IIJA, I would say a lot of the funding is for shovel-ready projects. A lot of people want this funding, highly competitive. It's really great, but yeah, so high competition, especially for those limited opportunities for pre-project planning. There's definitely some equity concerns. Only about 5% of WaterSmart grants have gone to tribes or pueblos. So a Nevada congressman introduced this piece of legislation to try to help address that equity concern and reduce, I believe, cost share requirements as well. This didn't pass last Congress, but it was introduced as far as I know. So we're definitely interested in working with Teresa Leisure Fernandez, who is an original co-sponsor, who's here in New Mexico, and others to see this through, and hopefully it passes this Congress. And then the last thing that I'll talk about is a timing component. So there can be big delays when people are awarded funds between when they actually see those kind of hit the bank. So the visual here is just that seasons can pass, it seems like, before you see those funds sometimes. I've heard delays are around 6 months, but that can be an issue with some of these really pressing projects. And then the other 2 concerns related to timing, especially for that IIJA and IRA funding, is that, there's a lot of pressure to get that funding out the door by 2026. And so we certainly, would like to see groups that don't have previous experience applying for and administering federal grants getting those grants. So that there's concern that unless you have that experience, you might not be able to get those. So there's a recent announcement from Bureau of Reclamation on WaterSmart opening up this month. I haven't heard more about that since then, but So TBD there, but cool that it's coming out. And then just to close us out, here are some resources. Again, you'll get these links through the slides. But I wanted to offer some federal and state resources to navigating these funds. And that closes us out. Thank you all for listening. Really glad to be here. Yeah, and I'll stop sharing. We can go to questions. Yes, I can put the links in the chat.
I've got those right here if you want me to add those right now.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah, I'll do that. Any questions?
Let's see, I'm going up here to read these. Oops. Yes, thank you. No phone notice funding opportunity. Thank you. Longer delay than 6 months. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Diana. I don't believe I missed anybody else's questions, but I can pop my email here in the chat. And if anything comes up, please feel free to reach out.
Cool. Thank you, Elle. And if we do have questions later, we might be able to get to those. So I'm just checking one more time before we go on that your questions didn't get buried between all my links. It doesn't look like it. Yeah, thank you so much. And we can then pass it over to Jesse and Kyle, and I will share my screen for your slides.
Great, thanks, Chelsea. All right, great. We'll get rolling here. Yeah, hi everyone. Welcome. I'm Kyle Balint, and then Jesse Kruthaupt's on here as well. And then we are both with Trout Unlimited. I'm based in Fort Collins, and Jesse's down in Gunnison. So talking a little bit about a couple of NRCS programs that TU is using currently to work on some restoration and water and trout habitat. I think it's important to understand a little bit about where, next slide, please. Sorry, Chelsea. A little bit about where this NRCS money is coming from. Farm Bill is where the two programs specifically that we're talking about today is basically giving our money. 7% of Farm Bill funding goes towards conservation title. Conservation title is where a lot of our EQIP, RCPP, SIG, these sorts of kind of river restoration opportunities are funded through. Next Farm Bill will be in 2023, kind of coming up. Negotiations are getting started, so expect a little bit of change there, but a little bit of background there. So next slide, please. So I mentioned two programs specifically that we'll talk about today are the Regional Conservation Partnership Program and the Conservation Innovation Grants Program, RCPP and SIG for short. Next slide, please. First off, we'll go to RCPP. This is a relatively new program, 2014 Farm Bill, $100 million a year, 2018 Farm Bill. It was adjusted to a standalone program, which was a really big deal. $300 million a year in annual funding for RCPP nationwide. A lot of opportunity to get money on the ground towards kind of large scale projects, and really a couple different funding pools. There's a state multi-state funding pool within RCPP, and then there's a critical conservation area within RCPP. I think the biggest difference between those is the critical conservation areas are geographically defined. There are priority resource concerns within each of those. In our neck of the woods, Colorado River Basin specifically has a critical conservation area, and that is actually how our RCPP that Jesse and others submitted earlier is funded through. RCPP is a bit different than a traditional grant. It's actually a program contract. So it doesn't function quite like an equip contract or CSP contract. There's a bit of nuance to that. And specifically, there's a kind of an RCPP classic and an alternative funding arrangement. The AFA makes it a bit easier to dole out that money from the partner to producers. And that is actually how our current RCPP is functioning. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, critical conservation areas. Here's just kind of a quick slide showing you, where those are in the U.S. and kind of our CRB, Colorado River Basin critical conservation area. Priority resource concerns in the Colorado River Basin include inadequate habitat, insufficient water, drought, soil quality degradation, and water quality degradation. So to qualify for an RCPP via the critical conservation area, you need to address at least one of those priority resource concerns. Next slide, please. So I'll turn it over to Jesse here. He can talk more in depth about our actual on the ground RCPP work happening in his neck of the woods. Thanks.
Thanks, Kyle. Appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, again, I'm Jesse Kruthaupt with Trout Unlimited. I'm in the Upper Gunnison Basin, live in Gunnison. Primarily do on the ground work, and had been really involved with the stream management planning effort for since 17 or 2018 range. As we we're reaching out to stakeholders and working with local partners, identifying needs, we've had no issues identifying projects, and decided that we needed to track down some additional funding to kind of start carrying some of these projects out. Hence moving forward with the RCPP application. We went with the alternative funding arrangement because it allowed us to TU is able to hire private contractors to do design and engineering, where there had been, at least in our area, there'd been some backlog on engineering staff, and just the workload that the staff in this area were facing. It was hard to get a project like an equip project through the NRCS process in a timely manner. So this allowed us to lock in the dollars in the contract with the NRCS. Those dollars flow through TU, and we're able to hire a private engineering firm to do design, and then the conservation planning, move through the steps with those consultants, and knock out the projects in a timely manner. We're looking at we starting this year, we're actually starting construction and design on projects this year. Let's see, that the RCPP was awarded in 2022, so last year we got it under contract, and so the initial projects will be coming this season. A lot of close coordination with local NRCS and the local water conservancy district on bringing other funding to the table, and coordination with partners on the ground with landowner partners. The two geographies are Tamichi Creek, which is east of Gunnison, and Escalante Creek, actually, which is down in the lower Gunnison. And those are just two watersheds or tributaries to the main stem that had a lot of these resource concerns and projects that were able to flag and fit right into those resource concerns. Next slide. For example, these are projects in the Tamichi watershed that we could really tie directly to those priority resource concerns, being the insufficient water and drought, inadequate habitat, soil water quality degradation, and water quality degradation. Here's an example of the first picture to the left is just a diversion structure. Not that uncommon to have kind of a hodgepodge of material in the creek to check water and get it down irrigation ditches. The next one is just that's just to the right. There's a picture of some stream bank stabilization project that's on the radar to improve water quality, reduce sediment load in the channel, and reduce water temps. We kind of came up with some different strategies to with the RCPP, something that is paid for performance. You can see a bullet there, which it's maybe an innovative approach to improve irrigation scheduling, where we can I'm actually overlapping some remote sensing on the some of the irrigation diversion structures, head gates, flumes, check structures down ditch, to try to improve irrigation scheduling and labor efficiency, water use efficiency, and also tying that back to how that can relate to improved stream flows and water temps. So I'll go into that a little bit later with the CIG, because there's some overlap with that technology. So next slide. And that's, yeah, so this is the conservation innovation grants. I think Kyle touched on it a little bit, but it's a competitive. I don't know, Kyle, do you want to take this, or should I just keep rolling?
Yeah, sure. I can take it. And then do you want to do the on the ground CIG? Sounds good. Cool. Yeah, I'll just give a quick overview of conservation innovation grants. It's another NRCS program that Jesse is using quite effectively down in the Gunnison area, and then a little bit in the San Luis Valley. But it's a grant program, functions a bit more efficiently and effectively, I think, than RCPP. Certainly more competitive, but it's a component of the EQIP program, really meant to kind of provide competitive grants to look at innovative technologies, approaches for conservation on agricultural lands. Next slide, please. There are two components of the SIG program. There's a SIG Classic, and these are really your early stage, smaller projects, 1 to 3 year timelines. Ideas, not quite sure if they're going to work or not on the land. Basically, SIG Classic, smaller funding amounts, shorter timelines, looking at proving kind of that conservation benefit that these can be adopted by agricultural producers. Next slide, please. Contrasting that with the SIG on-farm trials, which is what Jesse's using right now. This is for technologies that, a little bit is known about them, that there's a known conservation benefit. They're ready to be scaled up, and these are your longer 3 to 5 year projects with a bit more funding available. I think NRCS in general is looking for partners that have access to producers, can kind of get these on the ground, evaluate the project outcome for them. So yeah, big takeaway from SIG is technologies, testing them out, ready to be scaled up, and then different timelines for the two projects, but highly competitive grants, not as much funding as your RCPP standalone, for example. Next slide, please. Yeah, now I'll turn it back over to Jesse to give you a bit more info about what he's got going on the ground.
Great, thanks, Kyle. Yeah, so we went with CIG on-farm trials and applied for it in 2021. We're awarded last February. We got it under contract, and the approach here was using we're working with several EQIP eligible producers in the Upper Gunnison, Lower Gunnison, and the San Luis Valley. The idea is we're going to build out, the 2 initial sites, 3 initial sites in 2022, 23, and then expand those on-farm trial sites to other producers as we share that, outreach information and talk about the technology and the use and the practices and what the benefits are. And then we add additional sites in 2023, 2024. The basis is using, it's like a timer structure. We call it the auto tarp, whereas a lot of these flood irrigated meadows where, a center pivot or gated pipe or these other, efficient water application methods aren't really practical. We've gone around and around and like trying to develop some methodology that would maintain some of the benefits of the flood irrigation practices in these watersheds and these floodplains at high elevation floodplains. And what we came up with was this. Right now it's a timer type of structure that the producer can set a gate out there in the meadows, set the time he wants it to drop, and then it works in sequence up through the meadow or on that lateral, checking water and flooding segments of the field or out laterals. So that was the kind of the innovative approach that we went with. The second part of that, next slide, is this. There's the timer structure, a little snippet of it, I guess. But basically how that works is the motor in there is programmed to retract that latch at whatever time the producer likes to, what works for that particular field. And it drops the gate via gravity, floods a section, the next one upstream drops, in sequence, floods that section. Once the lateral done, they move on and come back to reset them when they're ready to do that next set on that field. The other part of this SIG was using it's called LoRaWAN. It's a long range, low power. It's a radio frequency. The WAN stands for wide area network. So it's just a network of these of sensors, whether they be water temperature sensors, flow level sensors, groundwater, soil moisture. You really could plug whatever sensor you'd like to into the network. It's just a matter of having the radio, like the computer chip and the radio inside connected to that sensor, communicates with the base station, and then you have that base station connected to the internet via Ethernet or cell or something, and you can communicate with vast areas with hundreds of sensors on one network that's low cost. So tying the irrigation scheduling with this wide area network for monitoring is the second part of the CIG grant. That's also a piece of the NRCS or the RCPP grant with some of the innovative approach pitched in the RCPP grant for monitoring some of the conservation outcomes of any of these projects. So, and sorry if I'm rushing through a little bit. We had a pretty tight window to present. So next slide. Oh, I guess that's it. Any questions, or feel free to reach out with directly to me, or plug questions in the chat, whatever makes sense.
Thank you both. And I do have your extra slides, so if there was anything else you wanted to share, I have those here.
Oh, no, I think we're good. Thanks.
Looks like Aaron has a question. Can you talk a little bit more about how you quantify and measure benefits like soil health?
What we actually are working with the CSU is doing some of the on the ground monitoring, primarily looking at yields, to use covering the labor savings, looking at producer surveys. Essentially, they were doing a pre-project, post-project soil health samples just to look at if there are changes over time. That's a pretty tough one that we're not sure that there'll be significant soil health changes in a short period. However, and it wasn't like a high priority resource concerns that in the application, but we thought we should include it because there's potential in some of these cases where there's a runoff from the fields, particularly like in the lower Gunnison, where it may be some of the salts and et cetera that we could capture using, again, the sensors in the either whether it be at the end of the field or in the channel, like if there's water running from the fields directly back into the channel, using some of those sensors in the wide area network to capture and monitor that.
Thank you. Looks like Diana Lane has a question. Was it hard to get local NRCS office support for the AFA approach for an ARCPP?
No, it really wasn't, because I work pretty closely on on other equip projects. I have a good relationship with the local NRCS. We've they have projects and are looking for funding assistance for projects that have gone through the engineering process, and we have an open dialogue. they are challenged with, kind of the engineering backlog as well, and they'd love to get some of these, things rolling. So it was actually, almost a collaborative effort saying, yeah, this makes sense to go after the AFA, and if we can, get some of these dollars on the ground, it's good for everybody.
Great. I have a question. And it's for Kyle. You said, I'd like to hear you expand on, you mentioned that you thought that the SIG was just more efficient. And I was just wondering if you could kind of expand on that compared with the RCPP.
Yeah, I think with the SIG program, the efficiency, on the ground and getting those dollars actually moving on the ground is a lot easier. I think Jesse has probably seen that more so than me, since he's working on the ground with those producers. But RCPP, it's a great program. It also has some administrative burdens kind of behind it in terms of just getting through some of the paperwork and applications and lining everything up with, our technical providers and engineering consultants and that sort of thing. So that's kind of where that comment was coming from. A lot easier, I think, just to get things moving and actually see some on the ground progress with the SIG program. Not to say that RCPP doesn't have that opportunity. It's, it's a large funding pool. It's there. It's why groups like us apply for it. But yeah.
Anything to add, Jesse?
No, I just reiterate that the contracting process with the SIG was just much more streamlined, much easier.
Okay. I don't see any other questions coming through. If you do have them, please, again, throw them in the chat. But thank you both so much. I'm going to pass it over to B and Scott. Skip through these other slides and we can always come back to them if we want. All right.
Right. Good morning, everybody. I'm Blongshia. I'm with the NRCS. I'm the Watershed Program Specialist. And I manage the PL566 program as well as the dam rehab program. So next slide, please. So technically there are 4 watershed programs offered by NRCS. Today we're going to focus on the Watershed Flood and Prevention Operations Program. It's got many names, so Watershed Ops, the Watershed Program, the PL566 program. Those are some of the names it goes by. We also have the Dam Rehabilitation Program, the Emergency Watershed Program, and then the Watershed Survey and Planning Program. Next. So the Watershed Ops Program is probably one of NRCS's oldest program. It was authorized by the Watershed Protection and Flood Prevention Act in 1954. And through this program, NRCS built flood control structures throughout the nation. One of the things about NRCS is we have probably built the most dams nationwide than any other federal agency. They're small, but we've built the most. It's close to about, I believe, 12,000 dams nationwide. Another fun fact, so the PL566 program, it's Public Law 83566, which just means it was the 83rd Congress and it was the 566th law they passed. Next slide. So some of the general requirements for the Watershed Ops program is that it must have a project sponsor. So we need at least some sort of unit of local government, and one sponsor must agree to be the financial agreement holder. You can have multiple sponsors on a project. However, typically the financial agreement holder is usually the unit of local government. It has to fit at least one of the 8 authorized uses in the program. There needs to be at least the 20% agricultural or rural community benefit. And it has to have a watershed plan, either an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement. Next slide. Some additional requirements: we can't work on any structures that are greater than 12,500 acre feet of flood storage or 25,000 acre feet of total capacity. What that keeps us out of is we can't really work on what's considered by the Army Corps of Engineers as a major dam. It kind of keeps those dams in their jurisdiction and NRCS out. A project will need congressional approval if the federal funding for construction is over $25 million, or if there's any single structure with a total capacity greater than 2,500 acre feet. And last, typically there's no other USDA program available for these projects. Next slide. So some of the sponsor requirements. So the sponsors collectively need to have the power of eminent domain, the ability to acquire permits and licenses, the authority to levy taxes, and the ability to enter into agreements with the federal government. So typically units of government have these authorities delegated to them. And, you know, in a project, we may not necessarily need to use these, but it's a requirement that the sponsor has these authorities. Next slide. Okay, so some of the responsibilities that a sponsor would have to do in a project is that, you know, there is a public participation component in this program, so they would be required to encourage and obtain public participation. They're required, obviously, to provide the local cost share for the project costs. They would be responsible for obtaining any permits, land rights, water rights, and any costs associated with that. We have them perform the construction contracting, specifically because a federal construction contract would be considerably more than a local construction contract. And they're also responsible for providing operation and maintenance for the project after the project is completed. Typically, our O&M contracts run from about 50 to 100 years. So it's a considerable time they'll be responsible for maintaining these projects. Next slide. So these are the 8 authorizations under the PL 566. So ag water management, through this authorization, you can do any irrigation infrastructure improvements, any ag water supply improvements can be done through that authorization. Next would be the watershed protection. And this is where we can do a lot of land treatment practices through this operation, well, through this authorization, any ecosystem restoration activities, or any, you know, upland treatments to cure any problems downstream, such as flooding, sedimentation, and pollutants. Next would be the flood prevention authorization. And that would be, you know, to prevent any to prevent or reduce any flooding, erosion, or sediment damage, or encroachment in the floodplain. Public recreation, this would be to provide any public or any recreational facilities needed for public or health or safety. Public fish and wildlife, that would be to do habitat improvements or wildlife development. Municipal and industrial water supply, this is strictly to provide storage capacities in reservoirs for M&I use. We can also do some outlet work and some pipelines. However, we can't cover any municipal or industrial wells, any water treatment plants, or water distribution systems. Next is water quality management, and this would be to provide storage capacities in reservoirs to regulate stream flow to improve water quality. The last one is water structure rehabilitation, and this is strictly for dams that were previously built by NRCS, either through the PL 566 project, the pilot program RC&D, or the PL 534. Next slide. So this is everybody's favorite slide. So this is how much we cost share through this project. So for typically all our authorizations, except for municipal and industrial water, NRCS plant pays for 100% of the planning and engineering costs up front. And we manage those through either agreements with the sponsor, or we can do them through contracts in-house. Well, we contract to, you know, firms for construction. It varies by authorization. Ag water management can cost share up to 75%. Watershed protection, those rates can't exceed our farm bill program rates, so it varies between 50 to 75%. Flood prevention is the best deal that we have. It's 100%. And then fish and wildlife or recreation, as well as municipal and industrial water, we cost share up to 50%. A big thing, to consider is that, even though we pay for planning and engineering, any permitting costs would be on the sponsor, as well as any land rights or operation and maintenance. Next slide. So the watershed program has about 3 phases. It all gets started off by a sponsor requesting assistance from NRCS through the PL 566 program. And then we go to a preliminary investigation and feasibility report. So in this feasibility report, we really look at, any existing data on hand. We're not generating new data. We're just looking at anything existing on hand to see if there are any, intangibles in the project. Are there any red flags that would stop a project? And it's mainly, to kind of filter through projects to make sure that, if we were to go into a watershed plan midway through the plan, we wouldn't find out we actually can't do this project, because typically, watershed plans cost a lot of money and there's a lot of time put into it. So it's kind of a way for us to see if, this project is feasible to pursue through the watershed program. There's typically a 3 to 6 month turnaround. And then after we complete the report, if it comes back feasible, we'll move into watershed planning. Typically, it takes about 2 years, if not longer, depending on if you have to do an EA or an EIS. And once that EA or EIS is completed, then it gets authorized by NRCS's chief. Our chief can authorize up to $25 million for the federal portion of construction. If it's greater than that, then we have to get congressional approval for the plan and those dollars. After it gets approved, we moved into design and construction, which takes about 3 to 5 years. And then we'll work into, getting shovels on the ground. There's typically about, at soonest 3 to 5 years from when you submit your request before you get to construction. So it's a long-term project. If you guys thought some of our farm bill projects were long or taking a long time, they don't hold a candle to the watershed program. But there are, large rewards in conjunction with this program. So next slide. So how to request assistance? Please talk to me. I'm more than willing to, go out and meet you or talk to you virtually. It helps us get a good idea on, how compatible your project is with the PL 566 program and identify any potential sponsors, and then request NRCS assistance. And we've got a template that has everything you need to ask. So, after talking to me, I can send you the template and we'll get the ball rolling. Hey, I think Scott's up next.
Yes, thank you, B. And Chelsea, you can go to the next slide there. So I'll talk a little bit about our experience. We've submitted a PIFA request for the PL 566 program. And like B said, it all started off with an initial meeting. So we had heard about the program and we sat down with B and others at the NRCS and had like a 4-hour-long meeting, during which we said, okay, here's our ideas. Tell us more about the program. We went through those sponsor responsibilities and we certainly checked all those boxes. So that was one of the first hurdles to clear. As we learned more about this program, we became increasingly excited about the potential of it. You guys it's a very broad program. So there's a whole bunch of different projects and that can be included in this funding. It's also, a very generous federal match. And so that was really attractive. The NRCS approaches the PL 566 funding on a watershed basis, so on a geographic basis, and that can go as small as a HUC 12, a hydraulic unit code 12. So if you imagine, you can go from a large watershed area to actually a pretty tiny sub-watershed area. It can cover individual projects, so you could have just one project that you want to move through this process, or it can cover a number of projects within a watershed. And that's the approach that we took as we talked with the NRCS. We let them know we leveraged our stream management plans. So shout out to SMPs. They're really useful documents for this type of funding request because they highlight a number of needs on a basin scale. So we had several projects outlined in the SMP as well as our district's own water plan that we had a number of other projects identified. And so we kind of pulled all of those together with several stakeholders and collaborators within our basin and made a request for that preliminary investigation feasibility report, that first step in the process, and that was approved. So we made our request in April, it was approved last summer, and then it took a little bit to get the funding for that all ready to go. So the kickoff just happened in December. So we have started into that process. And if you go to the next slide, please, Chelsea. This is a snapshot of our basin. We have 37 different projects included in that first PIFR, and those projects total $240 million possible dollars. And with that, we knew that we'd be going the EIS route rather than the EA route. And if you go to the next slide, those projects span a lot of different categories. So we've kind of covered almost all of the purposes within the BO 566 program, kind of focusing on watershed protection as the main overall purpose, but there's a lot of different projects that we kind of put into this. And as we've started the PIFR process, the feedback that we've gotten is, this is great, there's a lot of great projects, and the trick is two things. One, that there might be an opportunity to streamline some of this by splitting it out into separate PIFRs and separate processes. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that we went from one big PIFR to 5 smaller PIFRs. So that that number one, the PIFR number one, is a group of projects that we're going to move forward with right away. And we split off the other projects based on the hydraulic unit code. So you kind of see how we carved up the basin to combine geographies and projects into different groupings. And next slide, please. So for that PIFR one, we're going to keep moving forward with that. Since it's already started, we're going to carve off PIFRs 2 through 5 and resubmit letters for those. We're expecting to wrap this up, this first group of projects, the PIFR for that, up in March, and then hoping to move into the EA and the plan phase kind of later this year or early next year, depending on if the NRCS funds that next phase, which we're hopeful that will happen. And next slide, please. For our other projects, like I mentioned, we're going to resubmit a new PIFR request letter for all of these separate areas and separate groupings of projects. If the NRCS agrees to fund those, then we're expecting the kickoff will happen sometime later this year. So those are just the timeline on those will be pushed out, by 6 to 9 months, just depending on how those get funded. Next slide, please. Oh, back one. Thank you. B mentioned this is a long-term process. So here's kind of our optimistic construction timeline start for most of these projects. They need to finish the PIFR, go through the EA and plan watershed plan process, and then they'd be ready for design and construction sometime in the next 2 to more years. You'll notice that what's shown there is PIFR, was shown as PIFR 4, that EIS group of projects. So that's the higher dollar projects all happen to fall into that one grouping. And so we will still be pursuing an environmental impact statement rather than just an environmental assessment for that. So it's a more rigorous permitting process, and it requires congressional committee approval, ag committee approval. And we're thinking that one probably won't get kicked off until later this decade, basically. It's just going to take some time to get through all of the permitting on that. Next slide, please. A few things to consider. So certainly be mindful of federal permitting. Some projects that you might have, smaller projects, might not necessarily trigger federal permitting. And so if you do use this money, because it's federal money, it will require federal permitting. With that, though, there are certainly strategic opportunities. The NRCS is the lead permitting agency, and it's really in their best interest to get these projects permitted so they can play kind of an active role in pushing that process forward. Like B mentioned and I mentioned, it's a longer process. So if you have a project that's shovel ready and you need it to go sooner rather than later, this might not be the best fit for you. And also think about project size and possible groupings, thinking about ways to strategically either group projects in a watershed or maybe separate projects in a watershed to maximize both the timing and the permitting process involved in the PL 566. B mentioned the long-term O&M cost associated, or not costs, the long-term O&M requirements. So within a plan, whatever project has the longest O&M needs, all of the projects within that PIFR are held to that time period. So for example, if you have an infrastructure project like a dam rehabilitation project or something like that, and there's a 50 to 100 year O&M period on that, if that's grouped with a wildfire project, the wildfire mitigation would be held to that same 50 to 100 year O&M period. So that can be a challenge if you imagine trying to do the operations and maintenance, especially the maintenance piece on a wildfire mitigation area. You can have a very, very different forest 100 years down the road, and to maintain that could be a challenge. And that's all I have. I think we've got a questions slide with our contact info for everyone.
Thank you both. We've already got a question in the chat for you from Tanya. Scott, how much staff are you devoting to these projects? One full-time person, 2 people at half-time, or each? Just for grant coordination oversight. And she suspects that most implementation is by contractors.
Yes, so that's a great question. The PIFR process is done by contractors. So far, we're just devoting, a chunk of my time to this to get the process going. As we get into the actual administration phase, we might need to bring on additional staff or rearrange our staffing allocations to handle more of the contracting and admin requirements for this project. So far, it's been, just a small portion of my time as we're kind of moving everything forward, but we anticipate that increasing as we get further in the process.
Thank you. Any other questions? Just looking here. So one question I would have then is, you mentioned that your stream management plan was useful for going after these funds. And I know that as people are developing these plans, they're thinking, okay, when do I really need to start thinking about implementation? So I guess I would just ask, like, along what timeline did you realize as a group, maybe this is what we should go after? And do you recommend that similar timeline, or do you recommend people start thinking about this like early, and how plausible is that?
That's a great question. I think implementation, the point of doing an SMP is to implement projects. It's not just to have a plan sit on the shelf. Our SMP was finalized in 2020. And so, that's a 2 years from when we finished that to when we started going after this funding. COVID happened and a lot of other things happened in that time period. So I think, as soon as the SMP was finished, we started looking at how can we start moving projects forward. And, it took a little bit of time to shift from the planning phase into the implementation phase. In my experience, I think that 1 to 2 years of kind of taking that plan and really being thoughtful about how you're going to prioritize implementation is really valuable. I don't think it hurts to be thinking about funding right from the get-go, or even in the planning process. And a program like this could really marry up well with a lot of the SMP projects in our experience.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, thank you both. B, did you have something else to add? Go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, as I look at these potential projects, it was, very helpful that, Scott and them had the SMP. This program is a long-term project. So it kind of, as I look at these projects, it kind of gives me an idea of how serious are these sponsors about pursuing this project. So, that's also something to consider, is that, we'd like to have, sponsors who are very serious about these projects and, implementing them, just with how long this project takes.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. In our initial meeting with the NRCS, having our SMP to show them we've really been thoughtful about how to develop, watershed health and a number of projects in our basin. That was really appealing, like B mentioned, and it's been really helpful as we start the PIFR process, because we have, some of the documentation already in hand. That's all done through the SMP process. So,
Great.
and one thing I'll say, as we move forward to implementing all of these projects, once we're done with the PIFR and, hopefully the EA and watershed plan process, that's the design is going to be, we're going to need a lot of help from consultants, across the state for design, and then also moving into construction. So it's going to be a big lift, and we're really excited about it.
Well, thank you both so much for your presentation. I am going to pass it over to Anna, and I think it's a good transition because she'll be sharing about her program on federal technical assistance and getting consultants to help out with some of this work.
One thing before, just to briefly talk about the match requirements. So, if the NRCS funds 75% of the project, who's going to fund the other 25%? I meant to just highlight that, and also to tee up Anna's presentation, because my district is certainly planning to provide some of that matching funds in collaboration with other entities in our basin, but we're also looking at leveraging state funds to help meet that match requirement. And with that, I'll let Anna take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott and Chelsea, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Actually, I thought Elle did a perfect job sort of queuing things up for me this morning, and she was talking about the IRA and the IIJA funds, and that is really what kicked off this new program that we have at the CWCB, which is largely our federal technical assistance grant program. And there are sort of two sides to that. Each has $2.5 million. One side is our local capacity grants. The other side is our CWCB technical assistance grants. And really, the intent of these is tied exactly to those federal funding programs. So the goal is ultimately to help folks around Colorado apply for IIJA or IRA funds, or really any federal funding opportunity. At the end of the day, what I have to report back to the governor's office is how much federal dollars do we bring into Colorado? What does that success look like on our side of things? So that's really the end goal of these programs. But because there's so many federal opportunities out there right now with these, billions, gazillions, however many dollars are out there, it's something I've never seen before in my career, certainly. It's kind of hard to keep track. So the program itself is intended to be fairly broad. We're seeing a fair bit of demand already on these. So I'll kind of talk through each one real quick and then try to leave some time for questions here too. But the local capacity side of this is intended to be direct grants to entities to help them apply for these federal dollars. So if you already have sort of some projects in mind, you might have some consultants that you work with already. Sort of how, what you need to do, but maybe not, you don't have the technical resources to fully get there, but you know somebody and you can contract with that entity, then I would say the local capacity grants are probably a better fit. The CWCB technical assistance side is where we have hired a contractor. It's actually a firm out of Boulder called APT. We have them under contract now. We're just working on one more little piece before this program is fully launched, but effectively, this is intended for folks who just don't even know really where to start. They don't know what federal program to apply for. They just need a little bit more help on that front end. So then they would come into us, tell us largely, what's that project concept? We'll talk to our contractor app and say, hey, do we have the ability to even help you all apply? And then we'll kind of go through that iteration. And then ultimately APT would run with that, and they would help you get to that federal application moment in time. A few things to note on these programs. One is that these are all ARPA funds. So we have to have them all contracted by the end of 2024. And all of the dollars spent by the end of 2026. Other ARPA strings, which CWCB is not generally used to administering, is that you do need a SAMS number to apply if you apply for local capacity. Let's see, there is a 25% matching requirement on either side of these, and we can kind of talk through that as you've got project ideas in mind. And really, I think those are kind of the main highlights I wanted to share with you. I guess ultimately what we're seeing right now on local capacity, that one launched in September. We have 4 applications in, 1 has been approved to date. So the demand has been about $600,000 so far. I think I've had a ton of conversations. I think there's a lot of interest in this program. I think we've got another pending about $1 million in requests coming soon. So that one's getting fairly competitive. I think average ask, just as a frame of reference, is around $120,000, $150,000 is sort of what we're seeing on that side of things. On the local or on the technical assistance side, I expect we'll have that up and running hopefully within the next 3 or 4 weeks here. What we're trying to work out is just that nuance in between when you come into us and that consultation with our contractor apt and how that's all going to work out. But we're just about there on that side of things. So I guess I'll pause there and see if you have any questions for me.
Thank you, Anna. And Anna did drop the link in the chat for where you can find out more about that program. I thought I would stop share in case anybody wanted to come on screen and ask questions since we have some time left.
And if there aren't questions, I guess I'll just add a little bit more onto our process. I think that you can see on our screens here, we've got Chris Sturm and Andrea Hartmann with CWCB, who are truly the technical experts on these things. And so when applications do come in, our process is that we sort of look internally to say, hey, does this really fit with a potential IIJA funding request or other federal opportunity requests, but also does it align with the goals of Colorado's water plan and largely the goals of the CWCB. And to help assess that, we do bring in our technical experts to sort of look at all of these applications too. So they'll certainly be involved in this process with us. And so I would also, similar to B's presentation, if you've got project ideas out there, I would encourage you to reach out to our team on the front end. Primary contact for the federal technical assistance grants is Michael Reagan on my team. And then when we get to that implementation side, like Scott mentioned, the CWCB does have a lot of other funding opportunities for those matching funds when you're really just get ready, you've got that federal award and you need the matching funds to move forward with that. Our loan program is a really great resource. And then we've got a series of other grant programs. Probably primarily the water plan grant program is the most well-funded, but Water Supply Reserve Fund and a few other opportunities out there. So we can talk through sort of that next step once you get to that phase too.
Thank you for adding more context, Anna. I guess I could ask a question. Let's say a group is done with a stream management plan, or they're done with their integrated watershed management plan, and they're just kind of feeling like, okay, I don't really know exactly where to go with my next steps. And we have some projects like in a prioritized list. That would you encourage them to come to you and just have a conversation to see if this is a right fit?
Absolutely. And I think likely those who have sort of thought through that already and have sort of a list, but just don't know that next step, that's where I think our technical assistance grants will be very, very helpful. But certainly at least have that clearing conversation on the front end is an easy thing for us to get scheduled.
I guess another question I would have then, oh, here we go. Someone else is asking one. Perfect. This is actually a question for Scott. Can you talk a little bit about, did you read that, how many partners and or stakeholders are involved in your different PIPers and what generating buy-in with them looks like? Excellent question.
Yeah, so I think we've got something like 10, give or take a couple different partners. And some of the big ones are like the city of Longmont and Boulder County Parks and Open Space, and also working with Watershed Center. And so both, as you guys probably remember, the 2013 floods hit my basin really hard, and that forced a lot of collaboration in the area. And kind of from that collaboration, our stream management plan, the idea for it came out of all of that. And so there's been really great collaboration with all of these entities over the past many years. And we were able to build on that just again for this process, for talking to everyone, saying, okay, what are the priority projects? What do folks want to have included in this request? And so there was a lot of buy-in kind of right from the start. It was more like letting everybody know this opportunity was there, and then people were just very happy to hop on board. So again, kind of building and leveraging off of the relationships that were formed and continued through the SMP process.
Thanks, Scott. And I guess I'll ask my question. So your program just really got kicked off recently, right? Can you share a little bit about what the response has been? We talked about this a little bit, but just to give people context for how it's going.
Yeah, that's a great question. And kicking off a new program, and then when you have a timeline to a little bit of a hurry up offense to rapidly get this up and running because the money runs out quickly, or the time frame does. It's a unique beast, but we've had a ton of interest so far. I would say probably more on the local capacity side, because that's what started in September. And so looking at that, we've received 4 applications. 1 has been approved. I should have mentioned this earlier too, is that these are on a rolling deadline. So it's not like you can kind of just come in once or twice per year, but so that we can be very nimble, these are all rolling. So, as you've got things ready, just give us a call. We can work with you on that. Same for the technical assistance side of things. So I don't have a strong sense of the technical assistance demand quite yet, just because we haven't fully launched that. But my expectation is it will be quite similar. And so I would imagine just what I can see in our loan and grant portal, which is where all these applications come through, already pending about 1.6 million just on the local capacity side of things. And so that's, with a September start up until now, is a pretty high demand over just a few months. So it's a great question. I think it's going to get a little bit more competitive, but I mean, at the end of the day, our goal is just to help as many federal applications get in that queue as possible. So that's my ultimate goal here.
And Tanya asked, what is the average grant size or amount for this program?
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now, what I'm seeing is about $120,000 seems to be about the average ask. And I think to some extent, the limiting factor really is that matching requirement. So these do have a 25% match. And so I'm encouraging folks, when I talk to them, sometimes they come in and they gosh, I want to do all these things to apply for all these dollars, but then they realize that that match side of things might not be in line with what they can really afford. So we need to be a little bit strategic about those matching opportunities and leveraging what that capacity is on just the funding side of those entities applying for grants, and really thinking through, well, what ones are you really going to implement? And so that's kind of what it's based on. So there is no max request or grant award amount. There is no minimum, but what we're seeing on average is about 120,000.
Thank you. I'm just gonna, because we're just towards the end, I just want to let folks know that please, I've just dropped the evaluation for this event in the chat, along with our community and learning page about our stream management plan peer learning network. So please, if you have a chance, take that evaluation. And if you want to learn more about other events coming up with this peer learning network, check out that link. We do have a few more minutes, so I'll mute, and if there are other questions, otherwise we can end a couple minutes early. Okay, it looks like everybody is done asking their questions. So thank you to all of our presenters for sharing your experiences, sharing your programs, and your knowledge. Thanks so much. And for everybody else, I'll be sending out this recording along with all of the presentation slides and links within the next week, hopefully by tomorrow. So thank you for participating and joining us, and we hope to see you at our next event.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Good job, Chelsea.
Everyone. Thanks, Brian.